now I'd like to just introduce Pete. Pete Mento. If you haven't had a chance to read his bio, you definitely want to do it. You know, fascinating background and an extensive experience in the world of international business. Now, Pete, let me ask you this. You started out in life, though, to be a stand-up comic. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I was going to drive ships for a living, but I was terrible at it. So I stopped doing that to go tell jokes and be a comedian. And I did that for quite some time before that also became unnerving. And I decided to go back to graduate school and got a job in forwarding.
Right. And along the way, Pete got his PhD as well. He served as a partner and practice leader in customs practice firms of Ryan, KPMG, Crow. He has experience in freight forwarding firms, major ones such as Expeditors, Crane Worldwide, C.H. Robinson. Pete received his ALM in government trade theory focus from Harvard University and got his PhD in trade theory and trade practices at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. I've had the pleasure of working with Pete before, and he brings a combination of the ability to take complex subjects and make them interesting and digestible. And we're really fortunate to have him with us today. And today, Pete, big picture, is going to look at a few different items. Really take a quick snapshot of the global economic recovery. What's that going to look like and how long is it going to take? You know, obviously there's no crystal ball here, but just, you know, what does that look like? Kind of on a global picture, what are the challenges with respect to trade and transportation globally? What things look like in a post-COVID world, and then maybe just a little bit of the crystal ball looking forward. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker, Pete Mento.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's a pretty fun week to get to talk about these things because we've had just enough time to be able to maybe dissect some of the movement that's coming out of DC, and also just enough time to look at some of the outcomes of Brexit as an example, and also to understand maybe what some of the rumors and some of the more passionate talk coming out of DC has had to do with global markets. So as I always say at the beginning of any of my big public conversations, I really don't talk about politics, and I normally don't discuss them in questions either. What we'll try to do is stick to data and statistics and hard facts and work very hard to think about how policy impacts us. None of us are really in a position to change them. So what we'll rather do is talk about how we as trade professionals and logistics professionals can work with within what's actually happening to manage the movement of goods across borders and do the best we can for the people that we work with and for. And with that, there's a lot to cover today. I know that I think right now we've got 50 minutes, and I think we want to leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers, right? Is that about right?
That's
so
right.
I've got to do my best to get through what I can as quickly as I can. And it was about this time last year that a friend of mine had reached out, named Doug Draper. He and I do a TV show together now every week. And he said to me, what have you heard about this virus coming out of China? You think it's going to be a problem? And I was in New York at a meeting, and I started reading everything I could about it. And the more I read about it, the more I said, you know, let's err on the side of not causing a panic, but it looks like it could. And he said, well, then worst case scenario it for me. And I said, worst case scenario for you. I had been doing a lot of work about 5 years ago on terror attacks and how terror attacks could negatively affect economies. Most specifically, how a bioweapon could affect an economy. And I'd originally done it on a country level, and I had been asked from an academic perspective to look at it from a global economic level. And that was a lot harder to do than you would expect. There wasn't a lot of data available for me to look at what could happen if a bioweapon had, but there was information about pandemics. There had been a lot of work by the World Health Organization to say if a really awful flu systematically went through the globe and the population, how could that affect economics? I was shocked by this because I had never really heard of it before. But what was even more shocking is that data had not been applied to supply chains and had not really been applied to greater economic tabling, greater economic flow through. So I started to do that. And it was really just a a cursory review. And we did a video podcast in the end of January. And I said that if this thing is anywhere near as viral as they're saying it is, and it caught on, it could very easily close down the global economy. And we got lit on fire. The responses to it in the press, the responses to it on video, they called us irresponsible. They said some really awful things about us. But I said, I'm not predicting the future. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying that a pandemic of this type originating, from any major manufacturing source could probably cause a lot of problems, mostly because it would negatively affect transportation markets. You wouldn't be able to use air freight if people aren't moving on planes, because what most people don't realize is that air freight capacity, a lot of it comes from planes that are moving passengers. And then I also talked about how you're going to have constraints to ports, and there would be a long-term effect to employment. I just went off. So it was in March that the beginning of March, I gave my last public speech. I haven't given one since. So I've been doing speeches from my cell here in Manchester since. I haven't spoken. I've been back to DC more than twice, 3 times since the pandemic. I've been to New Orleans twice since then. And, I gave my last speech to an automotive conference, and I told them the economy is about to shut down, that there's going to be widespread economic impacts. It's going to be catastrophic to the US economy, catastrophic to the European economy. But I think the Asian economy is probably going to do well and recover quickly. And people laughed at me. I remember they laughed at me. And they said, when you come back next year, you owe us all a beer. And it turned out I was right on that one. The socioeconomic impact of it, I think we'll find out from years and years to come. But as we're all looking at it now, the World Economic Outlook, if you talk to people at the IMF, if you talk to people at the World Bank, if you talk to people at the UN, even if you talk to both White Houses, the outgoing White House and the incoming White House, they're not expecting a massive rebound. The idea of a 5.4% growth in GDP, I think, is a rosy outlook. But I think it's one that we can hope for, and we can hope for if certain things go everybody's way. A lot of that has to do with consumption in the West, but it also has to do with the continued positive output from the East. If you look at numbers that came out of China over the course of the past couple of months, they're very good. China appears to have rebounded quite well from a year ago. And at the same time, the United States did a pretty good job of lowering our dependency on Chinese imports. I don't know if that had so much to do with the lack of consumption or the ability for us to somehow export more to China. More on that, I guess, as the year goes by and we get more information. But as you look at these numbers and you see projections, particularly from the IMF, it would appear that the Asian economies, at least, look to be in a much better situation than just about the rest of the world. I think the European Union numbers are a little bit more optimistic than I would give them credit for. I think Brexit's going to have a deeper impact. More on that later. And what does this have to do with people and transportation? As we see, capacity has been constrained both in air and ocean. And I am of the opinion, like a lot of people, in the ocean market in particular, that ocean carriers are retaining, they're holding back capacity as much as they can in order to control the ability to control pricing. They're going to leave just enough space so that they're able to maintain pricing at a level that gives them the largest possible profitable output. And that when they find a situation where there is any excess capacity whatsoever, they will restrain capacity. They seem to have found that tipping point where they can control the market. It took a pandemic to do it, but they've managed to. And I don't see a situation where any of them are going to defect from this agreement they appear to have come to. Now, why do we feel that the Asian economies came back so quickly? Well, it's simple. They were some of the first to lock down. They were able to do it in a way that was effective. And I guess we'll learn more 10, 15 years from now. One of the problems with being involved heavily in economics as a quote unquote science is it takes a long time to gather all the fundamental data, but also there's a lot of stuff that's tangential. When are we going to find out how much of this was a cultural response to more preventative attitudes towards medicine? When I was a young man, when I was 12 years old and I would be in Asia, I always remembered people walking around with masks and thinking to myself, well, that's odd. And realizing that that was a preventative measure that people did to not get sick in the first place. As opposed to, as an American, I just assumed that there would be medicines to cure me if I ever got sick. But now, looking back on it, that may have been one of the reasons that they were able to stop it so quickly. We can also look back to how many of these economies had immediate, quick, swift shutdowns to travel into incoming products that came into their countries from China. And the swift, of course, attitude that a centrally controlled communist government like China can make that other countries simply couldn't. So that forecast and that movement that they were able to do, very impressive in China. There's good and the bad that comes from an economy like that. This was certainly one of the good things, with the ability to actually shut down that economy as quickly as they could. Now, if you look to the left side of this graph, at least the top part of it, we see the United States and Canada, certainly Japan, the ability for them to grow on those forecasts. I think that these numbers may have been a little more rambunctious than we should have given them credit for. The rollouts of vaccines in the United States have not gone as fast as we expected them to. If you listen to news reports currently, if you pay more attention to them, it is highly unlikely that we'll be vaccinated in the United States to the point that we had hoped to have been, probably leading up until the fall of 2021. There's also a psychological component about America's desire to be in large groups. You can ask yourself how likely it is that you'll want to be in a theater. You'll want to be in a large shopping mall, movie theaters, sporting events, any sort of gathering large collections of people. How long will we be as a nation away from larger social environments, from our larger social economy? And how will that affect the broader economy? As trade and transportation professionals, we have to remember that we're called upon to move the goods that help our economies consume, and that GDP is massively a function of consumption in this modern economy. As consumption remains flat, or in some cases backwards from years previous, the need for that transportation consumption goes along with it. When will that need come back to pre-COVID levels? I'm not sure that we can really put our finger on that at the moment. And that leads us to this number. Where I do have some fear, and I think that this isn't being spoken enough, is that China is forever being talked about teetering close to a debt crisis. For those of you who were in the business back in 2007, 2008, 2009, we had a pretty ugly debt crisis that happened here in the United States. We have all kinds of cute names for it. When the bubble burst. We talk about when the rocket finally got lit and everything blew up and went to space. But in reality, what happened was a lot of bad lending decisions, a lot of bad decisions about math that were associated with lending came back to haunt us. And we're all pretty sure that it's only a matter of time before something very close to that happens to China, Canada as well, as a matter of fact. For China, though, what sort of impact will it have on the broader economy? They seem to have gotten out of this pandemic generally unscathed with regards to debt. As much as increased tariffs, as much as, in some cases, a decrease to consumption from the United States because of the 301 tariffs, and as much as this pandemic should have negatively affected outputs, it would seem that even many of these manufacturers who were just drowning in debt, they appear to have weathered most of the storm, but for how long will that last? And what can a central Chinese bank do to help them? Well, I would submit to you a lot more than a US bank could probably do to help them. That a Chinese centrally controlled government is able to pull levers that we never could in the US, and certainly do it without fear of re-election. But I think this could be the next 5 to 10 years where you begin to see them really have to deal with the debt crisis, really have to deal with some bad lending decisions, and probably have to put some rubber to the road and some real muscle behind what had happened. As for the United States, which, as much as you try to be global in your attitude toward this and not super myopic, we really are, like it or not, we are going to have to lead a lot of the world out of what's just gone on here. It's important to remember that whenever there has been a massive global recession, whenever there has been a real financial problem globally, the United States and its economy have been a major part, a massive part of leading the world back to an economic recovery. This is a very unpopular statement right now, particularly amongst economists, to say this. We're being driven to have a less US-centric attitude toward economic talk. And a big reason for that is we're trying to be more inclusive when talking about global markets. This is a difficult thing to do, however, when the United States still leads so much global consumption. Right now, 54% of the money used to consume goods on the planet is in the hands of the US population, which still, correct me if I'm wrong, is about 8% of the world's population. So if we're going to kickstart the world's consumption and kickstart the world's production of that consumption, it's going to have to happen in the US. And the middle class in China is not growing in such a way that it will change that. However, this will be the next few decades that you're going to see a great change in China. For years, the Chinese have been trying to establish many of their brands as global middle market consumption brands. The way I always like to illustrate it to people was, can anyone tell me what their favorite British brand is? You know, I don't know, Kevin, if you have one, but you know, what's your favorite English brand of anything? Can you think of something, a British brand name?
Um,
I'll give you one. Jaguar is one that comes
yeah,
to mind for people.
you go.
Bentley, right? Then German, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Blaupunkt. You know, Japanese, there are many, you know, but I would say, what about Chinese? And people would generally have a very hard time coming up with Chinese brand names. But Lenovo is a global Chinese brand now, Qingdao. And believe it or not, I think we can call Volvo a global Chinese brand now because of the ownership stake. But Chinese brands now are slowly globally permeating that market, where they're becoming products that, even though people may not realize it, those products are becoming consumer products. And that is going to be, over the course of the next few decades, a real market-driven approach by Chinese central planning, believe it or not, to get those products in the hands of Americans in the West, so that although, yes, these products are being made in China, the profits are coming back to China, because iPhones might be made in China and PlayStation 5s might be made in China, but the profits are coming back to American companies. So how do they find ways to not only produce those goods there, but to create innovation, create technological innovation, and also bring the profits back to China, Chinese corporations, to reinvest into more innovation, to reinvest into deeper supply chains. And more about that in supply chain in a moment. But I think this is a really important thing to consider on how we, as a country, both you know, find ways to help the world come back, help ourselves come back, and while at the same time understanding many things have forever changed. One of the things that I've had to relearn, and I'm always happy to admit that I don't know what I'm talking about when I don't know what I'm talking about, is our economy and the way that Americans consumed has forever changed because of this pandemic. I would often go to presentations where people would say to your face, retail is never going to be the same ever again. You know, Amazon has changed the world. And, you know, I'd say back to them, you don't know what you're talking about. There's always going to be these big box retails. This is all completely changed. And now I think we have to admit that maybe there was something right about that. Maybe it had, right? So it's an amazing time to be alive. But maybe many of the things that we've learned about how we gauge the global economy have changed along with this. And maybe this recessionary, deflationary episodes and how America comes back, maybe that may not be the case. But I'm willing to bet that we're still in that situation with regards to trade. All right, so let's go over some of the obvious things about what's going on right now and some of the pressures that are associated with it. The economy did not take as big of a tank as it probably could have. If I would have told you that given the number of deaths in America, the number of people who are infected, the length of the shutdown, in many states in America right now, you are still going to be hard pressed to be able to eat indoors. Your children are going to school at home. You are working from home. You are wearing masks when you eat out. You are not going to be able to have a realistic vacation. People are not flying anywhere. They're not traveling. Hotels are mostly empty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That the stock market would be at historical, almost ridiculous highs. You would think that I was smoking the electric cabbage, right? Like there's no way that could be the case. What kind of mushrooms are on your pizza, dude? But that's what's been happening. Um, Many people believed that it was because of the stimulus. No, you don't give a significant portion of Americans an extra $600 and some more money in their unemployment and save the economy. That's not what it was. A lot of it had to do with the fact that because of the state of our economy, we were able to endure. For things like this, we could continue to operate our economy because of the innovation of this networked age, where we could still operate our businesses staring at a webcam and managing our life on these computers. So let's not underscore that. This was, we got lucky. And the fact that no one knocked it down through cybercrime and found some way to make Zoom not work for a weekend, I think that had a lot to do with it too. Also, at the same time, when this trade war was happening, there were some global shifts that were happening as well, where many American countries that we weren't necessarily very kind to did some kind things to us. One of them was India. India has done a 180 with their attitude towards the United States, where they decided to, on an enterprise level, seek 1,000 manufacturing opportunities where companies in China are manufacturing certain types of products for American consumption: automotive, aerospace, energy, exploration, maritime, communications, the list goes on and on. They want to lure the manufacture of those products from China to India. And they're doing pretty good. They're almost halfway through that goal. So, and that just started in 2019. So they're trying to get 1,000 companies that are manufacturing in China for consumption in America to move that consumption from China to India. And this was not based off of any assurances or based off of any promises from the United States. This was just their way of saying, we believe that we have more to offer the American body economy than China does. And also, let's be honest, right? We've been trying to work on a free trade agreement with them forever. So this may be a way for them to show the sorts of building blocks and opportunities that could come from that. Japan, they've never had the best relationship with China from an economic standpoint or any other, quite frankly. And they've been working very hard to give financial opportunities to other countries outside of China. So there was an approach by them from a trade perspective of, if it can go to China, is there some way that maybe it could go to another country inside of Asia? Could it go to Thailand? Could it go to Cambodia? Could it go to Vietnam? Could it go to Indonesia? Could it go to Malaysia? Could it go to anybody but China? Have we really looked at the economic opportunities that are out there for other places of production? Some countries cried foul on this because of the investments that were made in China for production. Some companies did as well. But in reality, it was better for these other nations because it pulled a lot of people out of poverty, first of all. And second of all, it helped to, once COVID happened, believe it or not, it gave them some resiliency in the supply chain. And honestly, looking back on it, it's not a bad idea for American companies to do as well. You should always have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. More companies simply didn't. But this was a fascinating way where Japan is creating supply chain resiliency where there might not have been enough to begin with. And then, of course, there's Brexit. Oh, Brexit. Brexit happens. And for those of you who don't spend a lot of time in the UK or in Europe, a lot of these guys that are driving trucks back and forth from the UK to Europe, they're single truck operators. It's a family, or it's a man or a woman who owns their truck. They get up in the morning, they pack themselves a meal for the day, they make a big mug of tea, they jump in their truck, they get on a ferry, they go across to Amsterdam or wherever they're going. They drop off a load, they pick one up, and they come home, and it's a 12-hour day. It's a hard life. And it's a lot of time sitting in traffic, a lot of time sitting in trucks, doing paperwork. It's not pleasant. And I don't believe that it pays very well when you do all the math. So imagine that on Friday when you went to work, everything was cool. And then on Monday when you go back, when Brexit happened, you went from doing 2 or 3 pieces of paperwork to literally like 60 different types. And then you get to the Netherlands and a Dutch customs inspector walks up to your truck and like knocks on the window. And you're like, oh, no. And you roll your window down and you're like, yeah, what can I do for you? And the Dutch inspector says, hey, listen, I know this is going to sound strange, but do you have any sandwiches in your lunch? And you're like, I'm British. Of course I have sandwiches in my lunch. The British lunch consists mainly of sandwiches. Why? Well, do those sandwiches have any meat, cheese, eggs, or mayonnaise? Didn't I just say I'm British? I mean, that's like our 5 major food groups, bro. Okay, well, if they do, I've got to take them from you because European Union standards say that it's illegal for anyone to import eggs, milk, cheese, or meat. And you're like, are you kidding me? So this ham that I bred in on Friday from the same ham is suddenly illegal, but now it's not. Yes, I'm afraid so. And there were pictures that people were sending in of gigantic piles, like a mountain of ham sandwiches and egg and cheese sandwiches and cheese and pickle sandwiches at the ferry operation points in the Netherlands, because these were suddenly illegal cheese sandwiches. But those were the rules. And that was one of those things about Brexit that no one bothered to think of. There were all these crazy things about Brexit that nobody bothered to think of. Like all of a sudden, British sausages were illegal to import into that part of the world, chilled, frozen, or otherwise. And it was a major export because someone just thought that this one particular thing they had covered had not been in fact covered. Now, they sorted it out, but it took a while. It was a real pain. I'm a believer that they'll find a way to work Brexit out. But if they don't, in about 2.5 years, they got to go through all this all over again. This isn't in any way sorted out. You got to keep in mind what they're doing right now is a stopgap until they finally do solidify all of this. And yes, it's a great way for another country like the Netherlands, like France, to leave the EU if they want to. But more importantly, it's a great way for the EU to kick somebody out. Now they have a way that they can decide if they want to throw somebody out of the European Union, that they've got an actual plan to do it with. They actually have a methodology to throw someone out of the European Union, which I don't think people are talking enough about. If you were ever worried about how you were going to throw Greece or Turkey out of the European Union, you got a way to do it now. So here's the obvious ones. What am I doing on time? Oh, I got to step it up. All right. So threats to global commerce in 2021, these are bigger than you realize. The first is cyber, solar winds, and what happened at the end of 2020. It's not being talked enough about. It was the greatest cyber attack in the history of cyber attacks. It was so wide sweeping. It's going to take us years to understand how deep it was. It infiltrated our Treasury Department, which for those of you who don't realize is where the money is in this country. So effectively, America's bank account got hacked. Hello. It went into some of the largest companies in America. Some of our largest companies in the country got cyber attacked, our identities hacked. We have currency concerns that are pretty broad. You have some nations like Great Britain who are worried about whether or not they're going to have deflationary concerns on their currency, while all of Europe is worried about inflationary concerns. That's madness. We're a little concerned right now about what Russia's doing with creating their own trade bloc. So essentially what Mad Vlad Putin's trying to do is recreate the Soviet Union as a trade bloc. So recreate the USSR, but like the EU. I lived through the Cold War. That's gonna be a no for me, dog. Like, I don't need that, okay? Because any way you try to sell that to me, that is embracing the suck in a major way. I don't need that in my life, all right? But one of the main reasons I don't need it in my life is most of the natural gas that is consumed in Europe comes from Russia through pipelines, which can easily be turned off by Vladimir Putin. So how you negotiate trade, how you negotiate standards for trade, it can easily be manipulated to go on the right side of how you want Eastern Europe to have it by simply turning off energy. That is so bad. I will be out of this business probably when that finally gets sorted out. I can't wait for it. Don't call me when that happens. I won't answer my phone. The availability of air freight is still a major problem as long as we are not letting passenger air freight, air cargo, as long as passengers are not coming in from places like China and Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand, the list goes on, and most of Europe into the US, there's not going to be space for cargo, people. How are we going to deal with that? And as long as most of the cargo capacity is being taken up by leases and charters, by the big dogs, we're going to have an unnatural increase to costs on prices for inbound air freight. There's this new move to have two separate supply chains to protect intellectual property rights, one for products consumed in China and one's for the rest of the world. I guess Apple's doing this for iPhones, where iPhones that'll be used in China will be made in China, and ones for the rest of the world will be made someplace else because they just can't afford to have that IP resident in China. You're going to be seeing a lot more of this. It's just good business. China is taking its place at the table for international discourse. Honestly, it's about time. You're going to see China throwing its weight around globally, both economically and from a diplomacy standpoint. This will be certainly the case with regards to trade, and this will be the year they do more of it. So particularly now that we have a new president in place, more on that in a moment, you're going to see China expecting to be heard in more of the corners of discussions that are happening with regards to trade deals. Entry type 321 in retail, chapter 29 de minimis is going to be huge. This is the year, guys. 2021 is the year where every retailer that can possibly do it is going to find ways to try to bring product into the country under that de minimis threshold to not pay for it, not pay for tariffs on it. If you are bringing anything into the country and you've got an e-commerce website for it or a platform for it, and you are not bringing it in under the de minimis threshold, this is the year where you're going to have to dabble in it, play around with it. It is simply too effective. It's gotten too good. The players in the marketplace that are good at it are crushing it. They're getting it in here, 3 days post-click in the hands of their consumers. This is the wave of the future. Distributing your product from the US to the hands of your consumer off of an e-commerce click, it's just not how it's going to be done. It's going to come directly from the overseas manufacturer to the consumer.
Right. So, Pete, just a clarifying question on that for folks that aren't familiar with the 321. You're really talking about the rise of cross-border e-commerce,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then could you just speak very briefly to the de minimis levels?
Yeah. So right now it's $800. So a U.S. consumer can bring up to $800 a day of product to themselves from overseas tariff-free. And there are certain things you can't bring in, but for the most part, most anything that you as an American consumer wants to bring in, you can a day up to $800 a day. There's movements in DC to raise that de minimis value up to $2,000 because a lot of the telecommunications companies, a lot of computer companies want to be able to send phones and laptops and such. But it's not just for consumers. A business can do it as well. So if you wanted to move auto parts or chemicals, if you wanted to, you could do that as well. And these carriers, these forwarders, these couriers, they're getting really, really slick at this. They're getting very good at it, and their systems are top notch. The problem I've got with it is customs is getting frustrated and annoyed at how it's being done. And sooner or later, there's going to be rules in place that are going to be much more stringent, and we're going to come to a stasis. So in the meantime, the trade is going to push as hard as they can to get the process really tight, and then customs is going to come in and rein them back a little bit. But as consumers, we're going to be expecting this kind of stuff to happen, where I buy something and it shows up from China in 72 hours, and your customers are going to start to expect it. So you better get on the stick and figure out how you're going to do it. Right. This quote pretty much says it all. As we get into the new Biden administration and what's going on, the current expectation from the American trade and from manufacturers is that Mr. Biden finds ways to manage and deal with the continued theft of American and global ideas. The whole point of the trade war with China was not to reinvigorate American manufacturing. It was actually to protect American ideas. It was a war of ideas. It is systematic, it is well funded, and it is very effective. The Chinese alleged theft of American ideas. It's not alleged, it's well documented. So, the trade war was, depending on who you talk to, effective and ineffective all at the same time. There were lots of jobs that were lost because of these tariffs. There were many jobs in the future that could have been saved. But if we don't act in a way that allows us to find a way to force China to respect intellectual property globally by people who have come up with it, what has become America's expectation that we will be a leader of technology globally will simply fall apart. We are currently engaged in many trade wars, not just with China, but the one with China is at a standstill. And it's at a standstill because the issue of cyber theft of American ideas has not been properly addressed. Expect that to be at top of mind. Mr. Biden, as recently as yesterday, his administration came out and said that they are looking to create a coalition of countries who will work together to address the issue of cyber theft and the issue of IP theft by China together. So we'll see how long that takes. We'll see how effective it is, and we'll see where America comes out with it. But it's interesting that he's going at it. I mean, he said he would go at it as a coalition. I'll be interested to see how effective that is, because what other nations want is really not what the United States wants. So I can expand on that. I mean, what we want is a cessation, a 100% cessation, and assurances from China that they will, as a nation, no longer support the systemic theft of American intellectual property through cyber theft. That is not what India wants. That is not what Western Europe wants. So we'll see if they're not as stringent as what we're asking for. India and the rest of them, as an example, they want the use of the rule of law to stop people from stealing IP. We're saying stop stealing our ideas through cyber theft, because we know that's how they're doing it. The JV program appears to be ending, which was a major win globally for any company operating in China. We'll see if they actually stick to it. A lot of free trade agreements were abandoned. There was a nod from President Biden when he was running that we will try to re-engage with the TPP. This would be massive, particularly because so much American manufacturing has moved to Vietnam and Cambodia. So we'll see if that actually happens. Mexico has really come into their own post USMCA. I expect that to continue to be the case. Mr. Biden has already reached out to the president of Mexico and said that he will do everything he can to find ways to carve out what he plans to do on encouraging American business to stay in America. But maybe if it goes to CAFTA nations or USMCA nations, maybe there'll be some way that doesn't get affected with these tax surcharges that he's talking about. For those of you who don't know what that is, there is a discussion that if you move business outside of the US for manufacturing, call centers, or service jobs, that there will be a 10% surcharge on any profit that you make for that business that you moved out. But if you do that manufacturing in the US, there'll be a 10% tax abatement. Maybe that same 10% can be given to you if you use a USMCA country. I guess we'll see. The pandemic really pushed trade to the back of the agenda, but I think now that they're in office, they see that it's going to have to be addressed. There's too much in agriculture wrapped up in this. There's too much in what really is our innovation economy. When we come out of this pandemic, we're going to have to get back to it. Space exploration, aerospace, medical devices, et cetera. This next one, there has not been a lot of enforcement activity. Let's be honest. In the past year, you haven't seen a lot of that happening. But it's very clear from the way that DHS is being formed that the enforcement is going to be an important part of how trade is enforced. So expect to see under a Biden leadership that we're going to get back to the good old days of good old-fashioned customs audits. So expect it. And new leadership at every level. There'll be a lot of cleaning of the houses with customs, BIS, OFAC, et cetera. As that becomes more and more clear, we'll see what their attitudes towards enforcement are. And then as far as the future goes, before we get to questions, expect to see a bill passed, a bipartisan bill passed for the stockpiling of PPE. Expect it to be massive, $100 billion for masks, gowns, rubber gloves, you name it, all your favorites, and expect that it is, the kind of pork barrel spending that we haven't seen since the wars. Everybody's going to get a taste, kids. So this will be massive, and when it happens, there will be a lot of space on ships and planes that will be taken from it. I think that it's not unlikely to expect that there could be another lockdown if we see another rise in cases happen, if the vaccines don't come out fast enough. There will probably be another significant bailout of air carriers. There is nothing that you can point to right now, nothing that shows that Americans are going to be picking up capacity, both in domestic and international air carriers. Nothing. So someone's going to have to spend some money to keep these carriers from going out of business. I think this one's interesting. There's talk in Congress of supporting the research into automation, of spending money on trying to find ways to put more cash into automating supply chains, automating the manufacture of goods, and making America the first country you go to for robotics and further automation of production. That COVID taught us there were a lot of things where production and supply chain fell apart because we simply hadn't automated it yet. And that there's a lot of money and a lot of jobs in building that automation. So where people are fearful of losing jobs from automation, there's actually jobs in the building of the automation. So I think you're going to see Congress put money into that. Congress will probably also put some time and effort into cybersecurity, and where they're going to put a lot of it is in the supply chain. The White House, one of the last things President Trump did is to order more investigations and more spending into supply chain cyber, particularly in ports and in infrastructure where customs was engaged. And that will probably still be the case under Mr. Biden. The last thing I think I wanted to talk about was the vaccines and future treatments. There is discussions of everybody getting the first shot, like they did in the UK. Here in the US, if you get a shot, they hold a second shot in inventory for you in the fridge until your month comes up. In the UK, everybody got their first shot, and then they'll wait till the supply chain catches up with the second one. We are woefully behind in how many shots people are getting, so that might change. If that's the case, it could take up space in both refrigerated cargo going over roads, as well as domestic transportation for air cargo. These are challenging times, everybody, with regards to capacity, with regards to pricing. I don't see anything but prices going up for the foreseeable future. These are ocean carriers and air carriers that, if they're not struggling now, they were struggling for a very, very long time. And they see the current environment as one where they may be able to make up for lost time. They're going to get it while the getting's good. And I think that the government is going to make it easy for them to have new crises and new opportunities to take advantage of. It behooves you to look for areas in your supply chain where you might be able to find your own inconsistencies and problems in your processes to find opportunity. Because I'm not sure that your carriers and your forwarders are going to be able to squeeze much blood out of that stone. From a regulatory perspective, I think we're entering into a new environment where enforcement's going to end up, unfortunately, being an area of focus, because you've had about a year now where there hasn't been a lot of enforcement from customs, from BIS, because they haven't been able to put people out into the environment. So expect the tail end of 2021 to probably be a little nasty as far as that's concerned. But we're not done with the economic struggles. We're not done with the global problems. There's still headwinds. But I think as we start getting to the third and fourth quarters of this year, things will start to feel better. And with that, a great end to 2021 and probably a magnificent 2022. And with that, I will hand it back over for the Q&A and people telling me how wrong I am.
Great, thank you. That fascinating stuff. You've covered a lot of territory, and we've got quite a few questions. Let me start off with one from Gordon at the California Center. He's asking, how long do you think it will be before U.S. companies see new policies in place in regards to tariffs, the 301s with China? What do you see happening on those 301s with China?
So I believe that at least firstly, the 232s, so the steel and aluminum ones, I think that Mr. Biden will, as soon as we re-engage, he'll throw those away. So we'll probably re-engage at some point in the spring to early summer. And that list 3 tariffs on the 301s will go away quickly after that if we see some momentum from China. But lists 1 and 2 will stay in place until we get to a signed second phase of this agreement. It will take a while. You're probably talking 2 to 3 years before all of these tariffs go away.
So a follow-up question on that is specifically on the 232s. So the 232s were the tariffs that were put on steel and aluminum, including Canada, Mexico, the EU, China. Do you think that those 232s on those steel and aluminum imports will be dropped worldwide, or do you think it will be targeted to specific countries?
I think they'll go away worldwide because it becomes sort of a mea culpa by Mr. Biden, where he says to the world, you know, hey, listen, we're quieting things down. We're not saying that what we did was wrong. What we're saying is that we're coming to the table with an attitude that we're here to negotiate and we want to do something in good faith. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm turning the heat down on the pots that maybe we can all just calm down a little bit.
Okay, and you think the 232s will be the way he does that?
Yeah, because there's not really that much for us to gain by continuing the 232 tariffs.
Right.
I don't think politically that there's much more you can get from them.
Question on, can you explain a bit more about how and why China and Canada have found themselves in this scale of debt? This is going back to your earlier presentation.
Yeah. So for Canada, it's because housing prices never went down. So it's crazy. It's like the bubbles just hasn't burst there, and eventually it will. Eventually there'll come a time when all of this over investment in Canadian real estate will blow up. That's why. And now that we have some questions about energy policy in America, that might be delayed. So if fracking becomes a question in the U.S. and it's not a question in Canada, that might be delayed. So if you find that energy exploration in Canada, because of the price of crude, goes dramatically up, that might be delayed even farther. We'll see. But it has a lot to do with the housing market and some pretty fascinating attitudes towards home loans in Canada, a place where their banking environment's one of the best in the world, but they've just been making some interesting attitudes towards housing loans, people flipping houses and owning multiple houses. It's like it was here in the US near the ends of the 2000s. China, on the other hand, was just an environment where people were borrowing left and right to start businesses to export products to the US. And they were borrowing on pretty high margins. Some of them were borrowing outside of the banking system. Then they had to make payroll. They had to make payments back to people when the pandemic happened, and they didn't have any money to make those payments.
A related question coming from World Trade Center St. Louis. Why will it take until 2026 for Japan to return to 2019 GDP levels?
Well, a big part of that is the Japanese are not making enough Japanese people. Their economy is shrinking. They don't take in a lot of immigrants. There's just not, if you look at population growth in Japan, it's fascinatingly slow. So you got that to go with. Second of all, their export economy is not what it used to be. A lot of the high-end technology exports that Japan had for decades been able to really rely upon, they've simply been undercut or usurped by other nations, where there is a possibility that those numbers could be very wrong. Comes from the fact that many of the alternative energy patents owned worldwide are owned by Japanese companies. So that's where there could be a silver lining, and those numbers could be very wrong. Whether it's geothermal, tidal, solar, you name it, a lot of those are owned by Japanese companies, and that could be one of the changes. But when you talk about innovation economies, Japan is barely in that conversation anymore.
Okay, this next question comes from Mark Haneke, actually from the Sac Metro Airport. He's asking, given the stimulus spending related to COVID, what about concerns of inflation in the U.S. or the U.S. dollar monetary devaluation due to the huge debt ratio?
There's going to be an awful inflation in the U.S. Everybody knows there's going to be inflation. It's a question of how the central banks manage it. They've done a great job so far. They deserve a lot of credit, but can they keep that streak alive? How well can they do? And what levers are left to control it? I think that we're just going to have to, at some point, manage some inflation and learn to live with it. It's going to affect exports. It's going to affect jobs. It's going to increase some unemployment, but that's just going to have to be the way that it is. We as a nation and as an economy are going to have to live with some inflation. So it's just the way it's going to be.
Any prediction on what that might do to the strength of the US dollar versus?
Yeah, it's going to weaken us. It's going to weaken our ability to export. And it's probably going to happen at a time, the worst possible time. But it's take the good with the bad, right? You're going to have to make the decision about whether or not you ultimately do you want to continue to have increased rampant unemployment and people not wanting to invest in the U.S. in a time when the economy is down like now and keeping interest rates low now, and then deal with some inflation down the road. This is like a puzzle, it's like it's spinning plates. So some inflation down the road, as bad as it could be, hopefully we have enough with regards to a monetary policy like we have to be able to continue to manage it. This is not 1976. This is not President Carter. There are more things that we have now to manage it, and I think we should have a little faith in the central bank. Don't get me started. If you guys really want to get me started when I'm not talking in a public forum and I have a couple of drinks in me, we can talk about how this is all an illusion. But right now, I think that with the way monetary policy is being managed, we're in a new decade, a new age of managing it. It's going to hurt, but it's not going to be as monumentally awful as it could have been, say, 30 years ago.
Another question, going back to the cross-border and the de minimis levels. Where can I find more information about Type 321 entry?
Customs and Border Protection has a website where they do documents on informed compliance. And there's an informed compliance document on their website about de minimis entries, Chapter 86. Mm-hmm. And all you ever wanted to know about Chapter 86. Also, I have a trade school on it. If you just Google Pete Mentos Trade School. Also, I'm on my podcast, Trade Geek Podcast, available on all your podcast platforms. I did an entire podcast on it, I believe.
Okay, we've got a couple more. Jeff Deese, a good friend from the SBA, said, what was the comment about the JD program ending in China?
JV, joint venture. So joint ventures, it used to be that if you brought a manufacturing project to China, you had to bring in a Chinese company to act on your behalf as a joint venture. And technology that was used to manufacture that program was considered joint technology, and that other company could use it as well. New technology that was created together could also be used by that company as well. And in many cases, that technology was then co-opted and used in new companies that had nothing to do with that joint venture. And there are many Chinese companies. Your local Target and Walmart is littered with many companies that were started by the theft of American IP this way.
Okay, let me read this one. Andre from Business Bridge Asia. He says, we are seeing some signs of developing countries turning down American private investments to allow Chinese SOEs to take their place. So far, this seems to have only been a problem for large companies making major investments, but we are concerned this may be the start of a growing trend. Do you see this becoming a problem for smaller companies if bilateral tensions continue to rise?
I think that the Chinese are doing a very good job of keeping American companies out when they see that it could be a strategic problem for them. We did the same thing. So this is one of those places where it's a hard pill to swallow as Americans when you realize that through the 80s and the 90s, we did a very good job of keeping Chinese investment out of America. And now China's doing a very good job of keeping American investment out of China and Western as well. It's not fair, but it wasn't fair then either. So we're just sort of calling them on the same sort of behavior that we used as well. In as much as the World Trade Organization allows them to do it, they'll continue to do it. China has a lot of great lawyers. And when they find ways to use the law to their advantage, they will. I think that in the end, what China's going to have to learn is by keeping people from the international community out of their global business world, it will actually end up backfiring on them. The inclusivity of having people globally engaged is the best possible thing that can happen for their economy. They're doing it to their own detriment.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Oh, well, one of the questions that you showed early on that Canada and Mexico are lagging behind the U.S. in terms of economic recovery when they'll get back to that 2019 GDP level. What do you think that means for the USMCA over the next couple of years?
USMCA, new NAFTA, whatever you want to call it. Let's say that there is a DC-driven attitude towards scaling back certain types of energy exploration. Not a lot, but a little, that allows Canada to reposition itself as an energy exporter, because they haven't had the best couple of years. And let's say that the US keeps continuing to push manufacturing opportunities to Mexico rather than Southeast Asia and Asia. Mexico and Canada are going to just explode. Mexico is already killing it. And if we can support them, if we can change the diplomatic narrative with Mexico from one of, can we please keep your people out of this country, to how much more of your money can we dump into your country, it's going to be a hell of a decade, man. I think Mexico is going to economically have an absolutely amazing year. And in the next 10 to 20 years are going to be incredible for that country. Canada needs to diversify its economy as much as it can. And I think they're working very hard to do that with aerospace, certainly working hard to do that with medicine, medical devices. We'll see where they go. But they're too dependent on energy.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. One thing I did want to just quickly plug is that in partnership with World Trade Center Denver on February 16th, we'll actually be touching on one of the things that Pete mentioned today, and that is really about resilience of supply chain. So definitely take a look and join us for a discussion of supply chain mapping on February 16th. Once again, Pete, we want to thank you very much for taking time to join us and for sharing your thoughts. And Diane, I'll turn it over to you to close.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, we'll be sending out that information on the webinar, Mapping Your Supply Chain is Essential, on the 16th. So do keep a lookout for that. My apologies for my bad broadband earlier, but I did want to mention just a couple of notes. I wanted to thank our sponsors for the webinar series that we're doing, and that's B of A, Bank of America, AIT Worldwide, and also Sierra College. And just another note, we will be celebrating our 25th anniversary this year for World Trade Center Northern California. We are super excited. So as you know, our mission is to make trade easier by providing education, resources, and connections needed to enter and succeed in the global marketplace. So we will be sharing our stories and our milestones of the journey serving Northern California. So pay attention and look out for some of those things too. So again, thank you very much, Pete. Thank you everyone else for your time and spending with us today. So thank you.
Thanks,
with that,
everyone.
we'll say goodbye. Pete, any last words?
No, just thanks everyone. If you need me, find me on LinkedIn or hit me up anytime. You can always find me on LinkedIn. Take care, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.